For months now, the Air Force has been openly discussing plans to retire its most potent dogfighter, the F-22 Raptor, in favor of its next air superiority platform that's still in the works. And while the exact timeline remains somewhat murky, the fact of the matter remains: the reign of the mighty Raptor is coming to an end. Let's talk about why this is and what this means. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is AirPower. I have to tell you guys, I am always shocked by how technically literate the audience for this series really is. Instead of me teaching you about airplanes every week, it really feels more like a discussion with other nerds just like me about things that I'm really passionate about. The real truth, as most of you know, is that I'm not smarter than any of you watching. I just get to stay on top of these topics for a living. It's literally my day job. It's genuinely because of how smart you guys are that I'm able to cover really complicated topics in terms that I hope most of you can appreciate. But sometimes it's important to take a step back and discuss something that seems to be a pretty simple and straightforward story, like the retirement of the F-22 Raptor, so that we can dive into some of the context and the nuance that you might not see because you're busy, doing your jobs and living a whole life. Getting to talk about these topics with all of you isn't just my job, though. It's also what I really love doing. That's the reason I'm here recording this at 1 in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. More often than not, my boss is encouraging me to take some time off rather than asking me to work on holidays. But the truth is, I love what I do, and while I love my family even more, and I will spend the rest of the day with them, I figured I could spend a few hours with you as well. So before we kick off, for those of you in the United States or outside the US that don't mind hearing me talk about an American holiday, I'm thankful for all of you. You guys are the reason I get to do this. And while we're on the subject of gratitude, I want to throw out a quick thank you to all the service members who are away from their families for Thanksgiving and the rest of this holiday season. I spent many a Thanksgiving far away from home during my time in uniform. I know that it's tough, and I want you guys to know that we're thinking about you. But now let's get to business, because when the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor first rolled onto the flight line in 1997, it was an aircraft so unlike anything else in service that it would soon be embraced as the very basis from which a new generation of fighters would emerge, a generation we know as the fifth generation. Now, a full quarter century later, there have only been 3 more tactical jets that have found their way into service with sufficiently advanced capabilities to earn that coveted 5th gen designation. And despite these jets being newer and often based in some part at least on the F-22 itself, the venerable Raptor is still widely considered to be the most potent air-to-air dogfighter on the planet. Independent third-party analyses of the F-22 and its capabilities, especially as compared to 5th generation entries from China and Russia, remain very favorable. And with far older jets like the F-15, F-16, and F-A-18 not only still in service, but still receiving upgrades, many have come to ask, why on earth would the US want to retire the mighty Raptor? So I'll give you the bottom line up front, and then we'll dive into the deeper context. The F-22 simply exists in too few numbers, with its upgrades and even replacement parts all deemed too expensive to be worthwhile, and a new, even better potentially fighter already on the way to replace it. The Air Force simply sees the F-22 as a fighter of a bygone era, regardless of how incredibly capable it may be. Fighter development programs take a really long time to go from a sheet of paper to an operational fleet, so you have to plan well ahead. And while the F-22 may be the most dominant air-to-air fighter in the world today, the Air Force is worried about winning a war tomorrow. But the F-22 isn't without any tricks left up its sleeve. It's currently undergoing an $11 billion series of upgrades that will make it even more capable. But none of that can change the fact that the Raptor is an endangered species. And the truth is, that's no surprise. The F-22 was born out of the Air Force's Advanced Tactical Fighter program, which began in earnest all the way back in 1981, when the Air Force first developed and established their list of requirements for a next-generation air superiority fighter that they wanted to replace their already legendary F-15 Eagle. In 1981, the Cold War was still very much alive and well, and while the F-15 was designed as an answer to what America thought the MiG-25 was capable of, it was only a matter of time before the Soviets fielded their own next-generation fighter in the very same fashion, with the F-15's capability set placed squarely in their crosshairs. And to be clear, they weren't wrong. The Soviet MFI program that would eventually lead to the Su-57 actually started back in 1979. There really was no time to rest on the F-15's laurels. So by 1985, the Air Force was already sending out requests for proposals, and by as early as 1991, the YF-22 was not only already flying, it had already won the competition to move into production. 6 years later, in 1997, the first production F-22 took flight, and 8 years after that, it was in service. But you might recall that something else happened in 1991, and that was the fall of the Soviet Union. America had won the Cold War. By the time the F-22 was in service, the US wasn't just not trying to deter a mighty nation-level opponent anymore, it was already embroiled in a multiple-theater war against terrorist organizations with no air defenses to really speak of, and certainly no fighters for the F-22 to contend with. By 2009, America's standing order for 750 Raptors was slashed to just 186, with only 150 or so of those jets even combat-coded or rated for the fight. The F-22 was supposed to replace F-15s all across the fleet, but instead suddenly became an endangered species. And to make matters worse, the multi-role F-35 was following closely behind. So much of the F-22's production line was actually cannibalized in favor of building this new jet. This decision meant that any effort to restart F-22 production in the future would be hugely, maybe even prohibitively, expensive. And that meant that the world would never have more than 186 Raptors. The figure could only go down from there. This decision led to a skyrocketing per unit price for America's Raptors and created immediate concerns about the availability of airframes in a large-scale fight. It also drove up the cost of parts. With the aircraft's production lines halted, some components just couldn't be replaced, while others that would have been less expensive in large volume for a 750 fighter fleet became much more expensive in small batches for just 150 or so operational jets. After all, the Air Force meant to retire many of its F-15s in favor of the F-22, but instead got stuck paying to maintain, upgrade, and grow its F-15 fleets while also supporting a nearly artisanal batch of F-22 Raptors. Okay, so maybe artisanal isn't the most fair word to use, but you see what I mean about how this decision resulted in reverberating effects that would plague the Raptor for years. 150 fighters isn't that small a fleet, but when you don't have the ability to replace parts as they're damaged, or to replace aircraft as they age out of service, or worse, are shot down in combat, you realize that that 186 Raptor figure doomed today's King of the Skies to a short reign. But you may be asking yourself, even with such small numbers, why retire the Raptor when it still is such a capable air-to-air fighter? The truth is, it's because the threat environment has evolved faster than the Raptor's competition. The Raptor is so dominant in the skies because it's in many ways a bridge between two very different air combat philosophies. Its high degree of maneuverability, born in large part out of its thrust vector control, combined with its high thrust-to-weight ratio and the Raptor's M61A2 20mm Gatling gun, all make it an adept dogfighter on par with some of the best fourth-generation air superiority platforms anywhere in the world, even before you consider stealth. stealth. But the Raptor also boasts the smallest radar cross-section of any operational fighter in the world today, alongside a high degree of sensor fusion and situational awareness, all allowing pilots to engage enemy fighters from well beyond visual range, often before that enemy fighter even knows that it's there. So in a world where most fighters tend to either prioritize close-in boxing, like the Su-35, or long-distance sniping, like the F-35, the F-22 offers an extremely competent combination of both. There are certainly more aerobatic fighters in the world, and the F-35's sensor fusion and data management are a huge improvement over the F-22, but there's just no jet on the map that manages to do both of these things to such a high degree. But like all forms of technology, the value of the F-22's extreme capability set does have an expiration date. And to be frank, the Air Force believes that it's quickly approaching. While the Raptor may have been designed specifically to dominate air-to-air combat, the more potent threat it could face in a 21st century conflict would probably come from rapidly advancing air defenses, leveraging a variety of new or improved detection and targeting methodologies. In other words, the F-22 may still be the favorite in an air-to-air bout with just about any other fighter on the block, but that's no guarantee of its survival against the latest and greatest surface-to-air missiles. I'll quote Lieutenant General Clinton Highnote, the Air Force's Deputy Chief for Strategy, Integration, and Requirements. He said, "By about the 2030 timeframe, you're talking about a 40-year-old platform, and that's just not going to be the right tool for the job, especially when we're talking about defending our friends like Taiwan and Japan and the Philippines against a Chinese threat that grows and grows." Now that's not to say that the Air Force is giving up on the Raptor. They recognize the value in what they've got, and in fact, the F-22 is currently undergoing a pretty significant overhaul that includes things like new, stealthier external fuel tanks and pylons that'll allow the F-22 to fly further than ever before without compromising its stealth profile as much as the old tanks did. It also looks like it's getting new pods that will house maybe an infrared search and track system or a new electronic warfare suite, potentially both, as well as new beyond visual range weapons like the AIM-260 that's still in development. The Raptor will keep getting better in the years to come, but none of that can change the fact that there are just too few of them to be relied on for the future of American air superiority. And because of those low numbers, it's also not really worth giving it a full overhaul like it would need to keep pace with the sorts of technology being fielded today. You see, the Raptor, like many fighters before it, was not designed with modularity in mind, which means that its hardware and software are, to some extent, married. You can't just update the software in the Raptor to make it compatible with newer jets like the F-35. In fact, these two platforms can't even communicate via a direct data link. Instead, we've been experimenting with using intermediary and translating platforms like the U-2 spy plane. But it's not just computers, it's also things like the Raptor's radar absorbent coatings, which are applied in a different way and have a slightly different makeup than the RAM used in newer jets like the F-35. In other words, it would be extremely expensive to bring the Raptor's RAM coatings up to speed, which again would be a huge expense for a fleet that can never grow and only shrink. In a real way, today's Raptor is a lot like the Tomcat was in its own twilight years. In fact, the F-14's $38 million price tag back in the 70s, when adjusted to 2022 inflation, actually comes out to about $230 million per airframe. That's $1 million more than the F-22's per unit price when also adjusted to today's dollars. And while the F-22's troublesome radar-absorbent coatings and limit-pushing performance make it require between 40 and 43 hours of maintenance for every hour it's in the sky, the Tomcat reportedly needed as many as 50 hours of work for every hour that it flew, thanks to its variable geometry wings and, well, its limit-pushing performance. Like the Tomcat, the Raptor was built to win a global conflict that never came, justifying its immense expense and maintenance requirements against a backdrop of looming nuclear annihilation. When these threats passed, the high costs of these fighters became harder to justify in political debate, resulting in the early retirement of both in comparison to their peers. It's entirely likely that, like the F-14, the F-22 will retire without ever seeing the war it was designed to win. But right up until shots are fired, the primary and often under-discussed role of these types of jets is to deter that war from ever beginning. And like the Tomcat, some of the credit for preventing that next large-scale fight from starting during its tenure does fall squarely on the wings of the Raptor that nobody wants to fight. Now, to be clear, the F-22 will almost certainly continue flying for longer than the Air Force is currently letting on. It'll probably remain a fixture of American air superiority well into the 2030s. But in terms of the long timelines of fighter development, the Raptor's tenure as the king of the skies is already coming to an end, with America's next air superiority fighter being developed under the Next Generation Air Dominance program, closing quickly with the title. The truth is, there's little indication that this new fighter will bridge combat philosophies quite like the Raptor. It'll likely lean further into the idea of using sensor fusion, stealth, and advanced beyond visual range weapons to take out opponents from greater distances than ever. Whether or not the NGAD's approach to air supremacy will prove to be as dominant as the F-22 is perceived to be does remain to be seen. But one thing is certain. The Raptor's reign may be coming to an end, but the US has no intention of giving up its crown. On that fateful day when the last Raptor flies into the sunset, it'll do so with an NGAD flying at its wing. Because as far as America's concerned, the king is dead. Long live the king. And with that ends yet another edition of AirPower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.